Hello and welcome to our March 21st forum meeting. We're glad you're all here with us. We've invited Dan Chodorkoff to come and speak about social ecology. We invited him after a recent discussion back in January where we ran up on the political limits of ecology during the climate crisis. So we thought it would be interesting to hear the social ecology perspective and continue that conversation. The ideas of social ecology have helped inform a range of social movements from the anti-nuke movements of the 70s to the environmental justice movement, eco-feminism, and anti-geo organizing, anti-globalizations, and Occupy Wall Street. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dan Chodorkoff.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak with you. I'm located here in a little town in rural Vermont, and we're surrounded by snow at the moment, but spring is coming, so take heart in that. I'll begin by telling you just a little about my background. My doctorate is in cultural anthropology, but I've really devoted most of my professional life and my activist life to social ecology, which incorporates anthropology, but is really a broader perspective, an interdisciplinary perspective. I co-founded the Institute for Social Ecology in 1974 with a man named Murray Bookchin, who's a social theorist who began writing about ecological problems back in the 1950s and actually published a book called Our Synthetic Environment in 1962, about 6 months before Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, which of course is often credited with bringing the modern environmental movement to life. Bookchin's work was not as widely read as Rachel Carson's work because he based his work in a radical critique of social relationships, which he saw as the cause of our ecological problems. And from the perspective of social ecology, really there is no such thing as an environmental problem. These are all social problems. They're problems which are an outgrowth of our social relations, primarily the kinds of relations that are embodied in the centralized structures of the state and modern forms of capitalism, where profit and economics is seen as the primary mover of society. And until recently, and unfortunately even to this day, insufficient focus is given to the actual relationship between people and the natural world. And that really is the focus of social ecology. As Nathan said in the introduction, social ecology has been influential in a whole range of social movements, beginning back with the early environmental movement and finding real organizational expression in the anti-nuclear movement, the whole shift from hierarchically organized forms of oppositional movements, which we saw right through the 1960s, to the more horizontal forms of organization, the affinity group model, the spokes councils, that characteristic of much of modern social activism, not just in America, but around the world, was in part inspired by the ideas of social ecology, because one of the major themes that social ecology has identified as a cause of ecological problems are social relationships based in hierarchy and domination. And social ecology believes that if we are to ever truly reharmonize people's relationship with nature, we have to do so by eliminating those social relationships and transforming them into more cooperative, mutualistic, and democratic forms of decision-making, both in terms of politics, economics, and obviously our relationship to the environment. So social ecology, as I said, is an interdisciplinary perspective. I can't really define it for you adequately in 25 words or less, because it is a fairly complex body of ideas and it has a coherence. It certainly is developed by Bookchin, who is really rooted in the philosophical traditions, critical traditions that grow out of 19th century philosophies like Marxism and anarchism as they developed. So, which is not to say that you can't understand it, because they are concepts that I think are easily accessible to people. But it's an interdisciplinary perspective that draws on anthropology, on philosophy, on history, and very importantly, on biological science and ecology. Social ecology tries to present a coherent philosophical outlook. It's not a dogma, it's not an ism, but it is, in fact, an attempt to make sense out of things that often don't make sense to us. And as such, it undertakes a thoroughgoing philosophical inquiry. And for me, that's really what's the essence of social ecology is. It is a form of philosophical inquiry. It's a way of framing questions and interpreting history and social developments. I've personally found it extremely useful because it's allowed me, I think, to make a certain kind of sense out of things that often seem to make no sense. Social ecology is also very much a praxis, which is to say it is a theory which is in a dialectical or a dynamic relationship with practice, so that the ideas are developed, they're articulated, they're put into action in various social movements and various kinds of alternative organizational forms. And then that experience is analyzed and used to re-examine the theory and, if necessary, modify the theory. So it's an ongoing development. It's not set in stone, and it is very much a living philosophy. In philosophical terms, social ecology operates in three frameworks. The first is epistemological, which simply means that social ecology tries to interrogate how we know and what we know, and specifically ask those questions in relation to the concept of nature. The second philosophical aspect of social ecology is the development of an ethics. And it's an ethics that we believe, were it put into practice, could begin to help us reharmonize our relationship with the rest of the natural world. And then the third aspect of social ecology is its politics. And the politics are an outgrowth of the epistemology and the ethics. So that's sort of the three areas which I want to briefly discuss. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I do want to give you a grounding because it's important, I think, and one of the great strengths of social ecology is that it is coherent, is that there is a logic that flows from one of these philosophical inquiries to the next. Social ecology also operates in three different temporal frameworks, time frames. We look at the past in terms of history, but also natural history, the deep history of the planet and of biological life and evolution. Social ecology also looks at the present, and we do this from a critical perspective, trying to analyze and understand current ecological crises and problems and how they grow out of our epistemology. And then the other final framework, time frame, that social ecology uses is an examination of the future. So briefly, let me begin by talking a little about the epistemological aspects of social ecology. The central question here that social ecology asks is, what is nature? And I think most of us have a sense of what nature is. And for most of us, that's shaped by sort of the prevalent attitudes in our society where we see nature as something quite distinct from humanity. Nature is out there, nature is the ocean, it's the forests, it's the mountains. In our idealization of nature, it's of course pristine wilderness, which really doesn't exist anywhere on the planet any longer. But social ecology asks us to go a little deeper in our understanding and really rejects that kind of bifurcation of people and nature, that kind of dualism that grows out of traditional Western philosophical outlooks, and instead says that, in fact, people are nature. People are a part of nature. But nature itself is not a static thing. It's not a mechanism. It's not an object. It's a process. And we understand nature really as natural history. Nature is natural evolution. And, without going too deep into the weeds here, of course, I think biologists recognize that Natural evolution began with single-celled organisms in the ancient ocean and evolved and developed, became more complex as these single-celled organisms joined together to create more complex forms of life. And through a variety of processes, among them, of course, the famous Darwinian model of competition, but also through, and here neo-Darwinists, people like Jay Gould have shown us that there are other mechanisms that go into play in this evolutionary drama as well, including things like mutual aid. So we understand nature as a process. We understand that people are not separate from nature, but are very much a part of nature. But this is not the kind of collapsing of difference that often happens in other kinds of philosophical outlooks where we say, oh, all is one. Well, yes, all is one, but this is not the Hegelian night in which all cows are black. Rather, we recognize gradations and various points in the evolution of nature where humanity develops certain unique properties. And this is perhaps most easily understood by thinking in terms of the way that evolution occurs in what social ecology calls first nature, which is nature unaffected by people. And here it's usually through a process of adaptation, where a particular species will adapt so that it can maximize its attempts to survive in a particular environmental niche. When we see second nature emerge, we begin to see the primary form of adaptation in second nature is considered that nature that is affected by human beings. And here what we see, rather than the species adapting to the environment, we began to adapt the environment to us to meet our needs. And it's those transformations through technology, through artifice, even through such simple acts, seemingly simple, but ultimately perhaps the most profound act ever carried out by humanity, the creation of agriculture. So we see this grand drama of evolution unfolding before us. And social ecology asks, is there a way we can make sense out of that? So we're looking at the deep past. We're looking at evolution. We're looking at cultural evolution. We're trying to identify points at which culture begins to develop out of nature and then begins to shape nature to meet its needs. And you can't really identify as an anthropologist, at least I can't identify any hard and fast point where that first occurred. It's a gradual process, happened over millions of years of the biological evolution of the human species until we got to the point where we are today, Homo sapiens sapien. And undeniably, I think if you look around the world today, we can see that virtually every environmental niche in the world, no matter how remote, has been affected by human beings, by people. If you go to the Arctic and the Antarctic, you'll find mercury levels that are a result of human activity. We know we're melting the ice caps. The climate crisis is perhaps the most persuasive evidence that has ever occurred. Human beings have on the rest of nature. And we believe that with that understanding, there is both a responsibility, which means we need to really consider what impact our actions have. We need to think not in terms of short-term profit, but in terms of long-term sustainability. We need to adopt the kind of attitudes that are characteristic of many indigenous people. Here in the Americas, for example, there was the law of seventh generation where the Iroquois people never made any consequential decisions without considering their impact 7 generations hence. And it's that kind of sensibility and that kind of consciousness that we need to infuse within ourselves and our own culture and use those kinds of long range thinking to inform our decisions. So this is the deep past. This is one aspect of social ecology, and epistemologically, we're defining nature, just to review briefly, as natural history, as natural evolution. We recognize that while we are all a part of nature, all species and all aspects of life on Earth, there are also certain elements of our humanity that distinguish us and that give us a heightened responsibility to really consider what we're doing. Now, social ecology also sees within first and second nature the potential for a third nature to arise. And third nature would be really nature rendered self-conscious, nature aware of itself. And that's what we have the potential to become. As we expand our knowledge through biology, through physics, through chemistry, through geology, through the various scientific disciplines, we have increasingly amassed an understanding of how these natural processes actually work. And the more aware and the more informed we can be about that, the greater the potential for us to actually achieve the kind of self-consciousness that would allow us then to move into a very different kind of relationship with the rest of the natural world. Now, social ecology looks at natural evolution. And here we move into the realm of ethics, because we believe if we are to ever actually reharmonize our relationship with the natural world, we need to create an ethical base for that that reflects the actual dynamics of nature itself. Now, as I said before, kind of crude Darwinianism informs the popular imagination about the dynamics of evolution. Evolution is all about struggle for survival, survival of the fittest, the law of fang and claw, and all of that. And undeniably, competition, not so much between individuals, but between species in terms of adapting to particular environmental niches, plays an important role in evolution. But there are many other elements that also play an important role, and they're largely ignored in our society. And it's these less commonly understood notions that social ecology explores and puts forth. Now, in his philosophical writings, Murray Bookchin suggests that we can derive an objective ethics from our understanding of nature. Personally, I'm not sure about the objectivity, because really when you look at nature, nature encompasses everything, so you can see everything. But I do think we can identify certain dynamics that play in natural evolution that have direct application to our understanding of how we might need to reorganize society in order to achieve an ecological society. And these, very importantly, are principles of non-hierarchy. When we look at nature in the popular imagination, we see the lion as the king of beasts, and we talk about the lowly ant. Well, that's really nonsense. In nature and natural ecosystems, the lion is not a king and the ant is not lowly. Early ecologists talked about food chains, and they placed the carnivores, the big carnivores, on top of the food chain, and they fed off the herbivores, and the herbivores fed off the grasses. It was all organized very hierarchically. But those notions have really been thrown out now. And rather, people understand, ecologists and scientists who study these things, understand nature in terms of a web, a mutualistic, mutually supportive web of mutual dependence. So we talk about food webs instead of food chains. And the lion is not a king of beasts. Hierarchy in a technical sense, of course, is defined as a relationship of command and control that ultimately has recourse to physical coercion. And we don't see any institutionalization of relationships among lions. We don't see any recourse to coercion, to physical coercion. And even, sometimes when I raise this point, people will say, oh, but what about the alpha males in the baboon troop or the gorilla troop? Well, I think really what we're looking at there is not hierarchy, it's situational dominance. And it's largely to try to maintain exclusive access to breeding females. And ethologists who have studied these animals in the wild have seen that while that alpha male is over here beating his chest, the younger males will be sneaking off into the woods and procreating anyway. So it's even in terms of situational dominance, it's rather ineffective. So important point. And of course, the ant is not a lowly ant. In the rainforest, for example, there's something like 40 species of ants that play the crucial role of decomposing vegetable matter, creating nutrients for the soil, which then in turn feeds the plants, which feed the herbivores, which feed the carnivores. So there's mutual dependence there. So that's the first ethical point that social ecology derives from our understanding and analysis of nature. Nature is non-hierarchical. Secondly, as I mentioned, nature is mutualistic. It's interdependent. And we know that in an ecosystem that's damaged, where a particular niche has been eliminated, that whole system can collapse because that interdependence is so woven into the fabric of life. So mutualism is the second point I would suggest. We also see in the process of natural evolution itself movement towards ever greater complexity, diversity, and freedom. Freedom in the sense of ability to make choices, freedom in the sense of ability to move beyond instinctive behaviors to more thoughtful and considered forms of action. So, and we know, of course, if we look at the evolutionary record itself, that there is a movement towards ever greater diversity. And I'm not suggesting here that it's a steady incline towards greater diversity. We know the evolutionary record reveals extinctions, mass extinctions, ups and downs. But overall, if life began as single-celled organisms in the ancient ocean, we have certainly see plenty of evidence around us today that extremely diverse forms of life have prospered and developed. And greater complexity, both in terms of the biological makeup of species, movement from single cells to complex organisms composed of complex organs with whole microbiomes within them. So I think that's also undeniable, that movement towards ever greater diversity, complexity, and freedom, subjectivity, the emergence of the subject. So very important. We also take from our understanding of ecosystems the fact that ecosystems function through a process called unity and diversity. That in fact, all of these diverse systems, diverse species work together to create a unified whole. And it's a unified whole which is in constant flux, constantly changing, developing, birth, death, decomposition. All of these are functions of a healthy ecosystem. And we know that the greater diversity, greater biodiversity in an ecosystem, the more stable that ecosystem is. So it's another important point. So these are all ethical principles that we derive from our understanding of nature. The final one I'll mention is the notion of homeostasis. Even as ecosystems are achieving stability, it's not they're not static, they're not unchanging, they're constantly changing, there are constant flows of energy through an ecosystem. Death, birth, regeneration, all of that is contained within it. And ecosystems, healthy ecosystems have this remarkable ability to maintain balance even through all of those changes. It's a dynamic balance. That's what the meaning of homeostasis in this context. So these are ethical principles social ecology tries to derive from our understanding of nature itself. Just to review briefly, non-hierarchy, mutualism, unity and diversity, movement towards ever greater diversity, complexity, and freedom, and homeostasis. And social ecology then suggests that if we are to reharmonize people and nature, we need to find some way to incorporate these ethical principles into our practice. In other words, our social relations and institutions should be based in forms which are non-hierarchical, which are mutualistic, which encourage unity and diversity, and which move towards ever greater diversity, complexity, and freedom. And I realize this all sounds rather abstract, but as I said at the beginning, social ecology attempts to create a coherent theory. And that coherence grows out of an examination of these very basic categories that most of us never really bother to examine. This is the way that we believe that we need to think in order to create a new sensibility and a new consciousness which can infuse our society and then allow for the kind of social transformation necessary for us to deal with our current ecological crises. So I realize that's a mouthful. I don't know if folks want to take a few minutes at this point to ask questions or if I should continue on.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Please.
So you're sort of talking about this and framing it in terms of, ecological problems, environmental problems are really social problems, or it's sort of the outgrowth of sort of uneven social relationships. So is it accurate to maybe conceptualize this as if we live in a society where there's a lot of unequal relationships, maybe in the workplace, in the home environment, that it's sort of the outgrowth of these, I guess, contradictions that ultimately result in traumas or sort of undealt with feelings that then manifest sort of on a social level, on a society level as ecological, I don't know if it's accurate to say like alienation, or like we're more prone to pollute if we're just not in healthy relationships with ourselves. Is that an accurate way to think of it?
I think so. I'm sorry, you froze up in the middle. My internet connection here is terrible. But I think as I understand it, you're asking if these problems that we're facing are an outgrowth of social inequity and social relations that perpetuate the kinds of aggressive and violent and acquisitive behavior that is often used to characterize human nature in our society. And I would say, yes, social ecology believes that, in fact, the people's attempts to dominate nature are a direct outgrowth of the domination of certain people by other people, the domination of women by men, the domination of poor by the rich, domination based on race and ethnicity. And we believe to have an ecological society, all of those forms of hierarchy and domination need to be addressed and eliminated, that we really need to create an egalitarian society. So in that sense, social ecology is a revolutionary idea. It's a concept that calls for changes to the basic underlying institutions that our current society is built upon, and believes they need to be restructured using the ethical principles that I outlined earlier as a guideline. So we need to create institutions that are non-hierarchical, mutualistic, encourage unity and diversity, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, it's coherent. Now, this is, of course, a theory that has to be examined in relation to the experience of people on the planet. And here too, we use the framework of history. As an anthropologist, for example, I can tell you that if we, I'll haul out an old anthropological saw here, if we conceive of the whole of history as a yardstick, let's say, it's really only in the last 6 inches or so of that yardstick that hierarchical institutions have existed to dominate human society. Really, for hundreds of thousands of years, for almost the whole of our experience as Homo sapiens sapiens, we lived as hunters and gatherers. And these are societies that are defined today by anthropologists as egalitarian societies. They're societies in which there are forms of leadership, but they're not totalizing, they're not institutionalized, and they're based not on power over, but power with. When European colonists and conquistadors first encountered indigenous people in America, the first thing they tried to do was identify the chief. They needed a chief. They needed a big man in charge of everything. But that's not the way these societies were structured for the most part. Certainly among hunting and gathering bands, there are various forms of leadership that shift from activity to activity, and virtually every individual at some point during one age grade or another will assume leadership in one of those activities. And leadership is not based on authority, it's based on experience, knowledge, wisdom, and people are looked up to and listened to for that reason. And at the same time, those chiefs, even, and this is fascinating if you look particularly at Native American cultures, the war chief, they couldn't give orders. They couldn't mobilize an army by giving an order. They had to inspire people. And some people would say, hey, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I'll go along. And others would say, no, it's not my thing, not into it. They also had a remarkable ability to incorporate what in our society is often seen as deviant behavior. If someone was mentally ill, if they were seeing visions no one else would see, they weren't thrown in a mental hospital. They became a shaman. They were honored. They saw things no one else saw. They were in touch with a reality no one else was in touch with. Many Plains Indian cultures had an institution called the Berdache, where a man who in our society would be a trans person who we know is stigmatized and discriminated against. There they were honored and they were given a place in that society, and it was seen as a blessing to have a Berdache among you. So qualitatively different kinds of social relationships that really reflected, and this goes on, if we go through these principles, mutualism. Well, clearly in a hunting and gathering society, these were not based on barter. It was not, I'll trade you an antelope leg for a arrowhead. Rather, the survival of the group was dependent on people hunting and gathering food. And when they did, it was shared, not with accounting, I gave you an antelope leg yesterday, so you have to pay me back, but rather with the expectation that at some point in time, that will all even out. And even in terms of exchange, they didn't have a market exchange, they didn't have barter. Rather, the primary form of exchange was gift giving. Once again, with the expectation that at some point in time, the gift will be returned. But there was also a recognition that people had varying levels of ability, varying levels of access, and they found ways to compensate for that to maintain a more or less egalitarian sharing of whatever resources were available to them. And this is important because our society has this vision of human nature, that it's human nature to be greedy, it's human nature to be acquisitive, it's human nature to be violent, it's human nature to be warlike. And certainly these are expressions of human nature, but anthropologists who have studied these other kinds of cultures recognize that there is no single human nature. There's rather human potential. And the human potential is broad. And yes, it contains the potential for violence and greed, but it also contains the potential for sharing and caring and nurturance and mutualism. And that these are in fact the kinds of principles that sustained us through almost the whole of human history. And they've begun to break down only fairly recently in historic times and prehistoric times. And certainly those negative tendencies have accelerated with the emergence of capitalism and corporatism, which sees the making of profit and economic activity as the ultimate goal of humanity. So social ecology here also draws inspiration from that deep history of humanity. And it's one that personally I find very hopeful, because if I honestly believed that human nature was limited to being greedy and acquisitive and violent, I would have killed myself a long time ago. Boom. But I have hope, because I recognize that even today, even in the midst of the horrors of capitalism, even in the midst of the kind of ecological crises that we've created, people are still finding ways to practice mutual aid, to create horizontal forms of organization, to bring the ideas of cooperation, of non-hierarchical organization to the fore. And we're seeing that increasingly, and we're seeing it all around the world. I'm gonna depart from the sort of sequential points I wanted to make at this point, just to inform people about the movement going on today in northern Syria, in a region known as Rojava. I don't know if folks are aware of that, but Rojava is the Kurdish region of northern Syria, and the Kurds are the largest ethnic group in the world without a state, 40 million of them spread around through Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. And what's going on there is a revolution. It's a revolution based on actually the ideas of Murray Bookchin, kind of a remarkable story. There are 4 million people actively practicing social ecology in Rojava today. They were followers of the Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan, who's been in prison for 30 years. What began in Öcalan's mind as a traditional kind of Marxist national liberation movement evolved over time after he encountered Murray Bookchin's work. And he embraced that and he sent it out to the various cadre. And they've actually begun organizing, not begun, they've implemented a society based on these very principles that I'm talking about. And for folks who don't know, the Syrian Kurds, this is the YPG and the YPJ, these are the women's militia that drove ISIS out of Kobani. These are the people who rescued the Yazidi people from ISIS in the mountains. And they've now created a multi-ethnic society, which is based in feminism, ecology, and direct democracy. So that they're making all of the decisions through council meetings. Every institution they've created has to have 50% women's membership and leadership. They've created women's safety groups, which deal with questions of domestic violence and sexual violence. It's a remarkable story, and I really encourage you to take a look at it if you'd like. It's been covered in some of the Western press. There was a big piece in the New York Times Magazine and in the New Yorker. It's certainly been all over the movement press, but it hasn't gotten the kind of wide coverage that it deserves. A new book has just come out called Daughters of Kobani, which is about the women fighters. And apparently Hillary and Chelsea Clinton purchased the rights and they're going to make a movie about it or something. I don't know. Anyway, just so you understand that while these ideas are very important in the realm of ideas, they also have application in the real world. And that's what I want to talk about a little next. Let's move away from the deep past, from the epistemology and the ethics, and let's look at the present. Ecology offers a critical perspective on the present, and it differs really from an environmental perspective. We recognize the limits of environmentalism. Let me use an example. It's a historical example, but I think it's a good one. Here on the East Coast, back in the 1970s, we started to notice a terrible problem emerging, which was the problem of acid rain. And the acid rain was acidifying lakes and killing fish populations. It was destroying mountaintop forests. And it was a result of particulate matter, sulfates primarily, being spewed from the tall stacks in the industrial Midwest and being carried east by the prevailing winds and then falling as acid rain when they hit the Green Mountains and the Adirondacks and the Appalachians. That was a terrible problem. Now, environmentalists looked at that problem and they said, well, we need to put scrubbers on those tall stacks and that will solve the problem because that's the problem. It's the sulfates, sulfur dioxide. No, social ecologists look at that problem and say, well, yes, and we're not opposed to putting scrubbers on the strong stacks, but the tall stacks, but underlying that problem is our reliance on fossil fuels, which, as we know today, of course, are the major culprit in global climate change. So that's one of the big problems. The second problem is our highly centralized forms of industrial production that allow for huge quantities of fossil fuels to be consumed in one place and then released into the atmosphere. And underlying that problem is the whole concept of capitalism, a grow or die philosophy, which says you need economies of scale, you need huge productive facilities to be economical. And underlying the problem of capitalism, we would suggest, is that underlying problem of hierarchy and domination. The fact that a handful of wealthy people are able to have an inordinate impact on the fate of our planet without most of us really having any ability to influence those decisions. So social ecology in the context of the present constantly tries to deepen the analysis and the critique. And at the same time, of course, a critique is not just about pointing out what's wrong with something. A fulsome critique recognizes limitations, but it also recognizes potentialities. And that's a very important aspect of social ecology, recognizing that within some of these very same technological developments that have brought us to the edge of disaster, or brought us really fully into disaster at this point, a climate crisis, undeniably, that these same concepts have the potential to be liberatory if we can reframe them, if we can recreate them in terms of a more non-hierarchical, non-dominating, mutualistic framework. And that's really where the third philosophical aspect of social ecology comes in, which is the politics. And the politics of social ecology has three dimensions, I would suggest. The first is oppositional. Social ecology says, yes, we need to stop any more nuclear reactors from being built. We need to stop the extraction of coal and oil from the ground. We have to stop the construction of pipelines. We need to stop the mega dams that they want to build in the Himalayas now that will destroy that environment. Who knows what else they'll do. All of that needs to stop. We need to oppose it. We need to say no. And that requires protest. It requires direct action. It requires working within existing legislative channels. It requires every effort we can make to stop the destruction. And it's vitally important. And it's absolutely necessary. However, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient. It's not enough just to stop it. The second aspect of the politics of social ecology has to do with the creation of alternatives. We need to create new kinds of relationships and institutions which are non-hierarchical, which are mutualistic. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but these are the ethical principles on which the politics are based. So we need to do that. So we need to create co-ops, producers co-ops and consumers co-ops. We need to create new forms of decision-making, community councils. Bookchin developed an idea that he calls democratic confederalism or libertarian municipalism. And that's the model that's been adopted in Rojava by the Kurdish people. And it's based in directly democratic decision-making. And here he drew inspiration from tribal councils of indigenous people, even from the old medieval folk mode, and very much so from the New England town meeting, which, believe it or not, is still alive and well here in Vermont, where we come together as citizens every year in our little towns and villages, and we make decisions about our budget for our town, about our schools, about our libraries, about all aspects of the life of the town. And we've also broadened these town meetings to take on national and international issues. The whole nuclear freeze movement in the 1970s, or was it 80s? I'm sorry, I'm an old man and my memory's not that great. Grew out of resolutions introduced at Vermont town meetings. And clearly we didn't have any authority to affect national policy other than a moral authority. And it was the voices of people speaking out in their town meetings that really inspired that whole movement as well. So that's another aspect of the politics of social ecology. And then beyond the creation of the alternatives is actually entering into and transforming the realm of politics itself. Politics as it exists today is primarily statecraft. It's a few people at the top making decisions for others and supposedly representing us. But I think we're all aware of how limited that representation really is and how little often the decisions that are made actually reflect the will of the people. So social ecology suggests that we need to create a dual power. And we'll do that by creating town meetings and neighborhood assemblies everywhere. I've had personal experience that convinces me that this is a viable approach. you could say, well, you live in Vermont in a little town with 1,500 people, so of course you can have direct democracy. But what about New York City? Well, I spent 12 years working in New York City in a neighborhood on the Lower East Side of New York. It's a traditional portal of immigration. And this was a ghetto. It was a Puerto Rican community. The time when I started working there back in the 70s, 40% of the property had been abandoned by the landlords and consisted of either abandoned buildings or vacant lots. It was all city owned. And people went in to that situation and utilized all three of these aspects of the politics of social ecology. First, they protested, they marched, they carried out direct action. They went into the abandoned buildings and they took them over as squatters. And they began to reconstruct them through a process known as sweat equity urban homesteading, where the squatters themselves did the work necessary to rehab the buildings. And we negotiated with the city and we were able ultimately to get legal title to some of those abandoned buildings. People went into the vacant lots and they cleaned them out and they created community gardens. And this was really the beginning of the whole community gardening movement in the United States, urban gardening movement. They created low-income tenants cooperatives in the buildings that they rehabbed, the sweat equity buildings. And back in the 70s, the Institute was very involved in research and the development of what we called back then alternative technologies like solar energy and wind power. Everyone thought we were crazy, but we put solar collectors up on the roof of one of the abandoned buildings that had been rehabbed. It was the first urban application of solar energy anywhere in the United States. And we put a little windmill up on top too. And then Con Edison, the big New York utility company, said, oh, you can't feed your windmills electricity into our grid because you'll blow the grid out, our little 1,800 watt windmill. We took them to court. And the New York State Supreme Court ruled in favor of 519 East 11th Street, told Con Ed, no, you do have to buy power. And that was actually the legal precedent for the whole independent power industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States today. So, but more importantly, I also saw them organize town meetings 4 times a year. And this is a neighborhood of 30,000 people. They held neighborhood assemblies, town meetings, and there were 100 or more grassroots organizations functioning in the neighborhood at that time. They all sent representatives and individuals came and functioned as well. And they began making decisions for their neighborhood, which were often very much opposed to the official decisions being made. They created something called the Lower East Side Joint Planning Council, and they used that to oppose the decisions being made by the official planning board for the community, which was composed primarily of business owners and landlords. And then they were able to use protest and direct action to actually implement those plans. And they developed a blueprint for the neighborhood, working with professional architects and planners under the direction of the community. They went block by block, building by building. This will be artists' housing. This will be elders' housing. This is going to be a playground for the kids. This will be a garden to grow food. This is going to be a performance space. And they assigned responsibility for those projects to various block associations and other kinds of community organizations. And they began carrying it out. So I've seen that this approach can work. It can be effective, and not just in small towns, rural communities, but in big cities as well, though it has to be decentralized. This human scale is a very important aspect of all of this. So I've been going for almost an hour now. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I hope I've raised some issues here that folks find interesting. Let me just finish up though, if I may. I had forgotten one other aspect of the democratic confederalism that I wanted to mention. The idea is not just to create little town meetings and little neighborhood assemblies, but to use them then to begin to contest for power with the existing political institutions. And to begin, and you can do this within a democratic framework, within a constitutional framework, by changing city charters, to disempowering things like the city council and putting that power back in the hands of the neighborhoods. And beyond that decentralization, the flip side of that is the idea of confederation, where you would take all of these different community assemblies, neighborhood assemblies, and they would meet together in a citywide assembly with representation from each neighborhood group. But representation meaning that people there are actually representing decisions that have been made locally, democratically, through direct democracy. And then conceivably, you begin to expand that confederation so that different cities within a region begin to meet in a regional assembly, and then ultimately a continental assembly, and then a global assembly. I know that this sounds utopian, and there's a reason for that. It is utopian because this is the third dimension of social ecology. Social ecology thinks about the future, and we take it very seriously. But rather than using the kind of systems theory that informs most thinking about the future, futurism, where you take what exists and you project it into the future. You know, if we're using X barrels of oil a day now, in 10 years, we'll be using so much more. Rather, social ecology takes a utopian perspective. And here I have to take a moment just to defend the word utopia because it's fallen into disrepute. In our society, when you say something is utopian, it's a term that's used as a dismissive. Oh, that's utopian. That's cloud cuckoo land. That's unrealistic. That could never happen. But if you know anything of the etymology of the word, that's not really what the word utopia means. And that's not what the utopian tradition has expressed. The utopian tradition is one of the earliest forms of philosophical inquiry. In the West, you can take it right back to Plato. Plato's Republic, really the archetypal utopia. If you look at the etymology of the word, it was coined by Sir Thomas More in 1515. More was notorious for wordplay. He claimed there were two roots to the word, both from the ancient Greek, and pardon my ancient Greek, because it's not very good if I mispronounce here, but the first was the word autopia, which means no place. And the other was the word utopia, which means the good place. And both of those definitions have adhered to the concept of utopia. We're not talking about utopia as cloud cuckoo land, utopia as no place. Not talking about Charles Fourier's oceans turning to lemonade, though with the acidification of the ocean going on today, we may be headed in that direction. Rather, we're talking about utopia as a good place. And it's utopia rooted in real existing potentialities. And here I go back to that concept of critique, that idea of thinking dialectically. What are the limitations of a phenomena and what are the potentialities? What are the possibilities that it represents? And we try to tease out those possibilities and use that to inform our vision of the future. And it's a future very much rooted in the ethics and the politics of social ecology and our understanding of nature as natural evolution. It's a logical outgrowth of all of that. And I want to emphasize too here that we're not talking about a single utopia that can, a blueprint that can be applied to the whole world. I mean, that would be a horrible thing. You know, in Moore's Utopia, he goes on about the island where all cities are exactly alike so that wherever you are, you always know where you are. What a great thing that, no, what a horrible thing that is. That's an expression of one person's utopia is another person's hell. That would be hell for me. Rather, what we're talking about is utopias that develop in relation to the particularities of the history, the culture, and the environment of a given place. That they're informed by a broad set of principles, which I would suggest are the principles of social ecology, that those are utopian in terms of their striving, in terms of the possibilities they present, but the actual application of those principles will vary tremendously from place to place, as it should. So that's really an overview of social ecology, and I know I've thrown a lot out there, but I would like to suggest to you that it, at least from my perspective, is an extremely valuable framework. It's a way of looking at the world and understanding the dynamics that are currently shaping our planet. And I think the kind of radical changes, dramatically radical changes that need to be made in order to achieve that. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, that we should have an insurrection in the classic 19th century sense where we storm the barricades or go out with weapons to fight against the state. Rather, I'm saying that we need to be programmatic in the way we approach this. We need to recognize that there are things that are achievable now and other things that may have to wait for the future. But we have a minimum program, which might be the kind of Green New Deal that's being suggested by AOC and others in our government. For me, that's the minimum program. From there, I would want to have a transitional program that would be moving us towards a more egalitarian, less hierarchical, more truly democratic society. And then, of course, the ultimate goal, the maximum program, if you will, would be a truly ecological society rooted in a confederal direct democracy and informed by the principles of non-hierarchical forms of organization, mutualism, unity and diversity, movement towards ever greater complexity, diversity, and freedom, and homeostasis. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks for the talk. We have a few questions here. One says, thanks for putting the ecological and political problems in broad perspective. We don't often have a discussion that looks like these issues in that broader perspective. Understanding that capitalism can't resolve the problems humans face, what would a world system beyond capitalism that reaches what you have identified as third nature look like? How do you see these global, how do you see this global interdependence that exists now in that context?
Well, I think any revolutionary project is an educational project. So I think really what we're looking at is a vast educational project. But I take heart because I think there are historic examples of those kinds of educational projects that have resulted in ground-shaking changes in the restructuring of society. I take as an example the Enlightenment, and certainly in terms of content, there's a lot that was problematic and continues to be problematic about Enlightenment thinking. But in terms of the process, I think it's illustrative of what we're in the midst of today. You know, initially, these were extremely radical ideas held by a tiny handful of people. The idea that the king was not king because of divine right. The idea that people could actually themselves make decisions that affected their lives. Radical, earth-shaking ideas held by a tiny group and then disseminated slowly out over 100 years or so through discussions over tables at taverns, through pamphlets. You know, literacy was limited then. And then ultimately these ideas gave birth to the democratic revolutions of the 18th century. American Revolution, French Revolution, those are direct outgrowths of the Enlightenment. And I think we're already in the midst of that process. Only it's not just a tiny handful of people who hold these ideas now, it's millions of people around the world already. Internationally, I mean, I'm part of lots of international networks that are working actively with these ideas throughout the global South, throughout Europe, Asia, Africa. There's a Pan-African social ecology movement. So those ideas are already percolating, I think. And it's not going to take hundreds of years because we have the internet, we have computers, we have higher rates of literacy, we have access to information at levels that people never had before. And as that education begins to sink in, people's consciousness and sensibility will change, and they begin to act on these ideas. And that action, I hope, is going to lead to a basic restructuring of the underlying institutions that govern our society today, the replacement of the nation state by a confederation of directly democratic communities, the replacement of capitalism by a moral economy in which, and I'm not saying we have to eliminate the market completely, but a moral economy in which people's basic human needs are met, and that's seen as the primary goal of economics rather than accumulating wealth for a few. And I see the world, you know, I go back to that wonderful phrase that Martin Luther King used about the arc of history being long. Well, it is long, but I also think it's bending in the right direction. And that's not to discount the threats that we face, which are unprecedented. No question about that, no question about that. We're in a very precarious situation right now. But I think the way out is becoming increasingly clear to increasingly large numbers of people. We need to find some way to empower that movement and use that power to leverage the kind of change that is necessary. So I don't know if that addresses your question. You know, I wish I had a mantra or a neat and tidy kind of approach that we could package and put out there, but I don't. I think it's, you know, it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but I do see enough positive things happening that I'm hopeful.
I have a question. I think, let me see if I can sort of formulate it. And it, I guess, is seeking to sort of inquire about the ethics of social ecology. So it seems to me, as I hear you saying, you know, if as a society, or a community, or a grouping of people, if we look out sort of at ecological process, increasing complexity, and we think about sort of how we organize and structure our society. If maybe there's a way in which, if we sort of respected everyone for their own sort of unique adaptation ability, just sense of self, instead of organizing ourselves where, you know, we're above or below, you know, there's these hierarchies, that it's through sort of educating ourselves on that change, maybe there's an empathy component, and then in acting sort of justly, democratically, we're sort of in that process, that transformative process, and sort of through thinking about nature, and maybe starting to implement it, that we're then living the ethics? Or is that, am I sort of?
Well, absolutely. I think, you know, we obviously larger structural changes are needed, but we do each need to take individual responsibility and do whatever we can to incorporate those kinds of ethics into all of our relationships and into our lives as fully as possible. And I'm hopeful on that level. I see a lot of that happening. I see a lot of growing kind of ecological consciousness among individuals. I'm just concerned that the way our system has presented it is that somehow we are the problem. And yes, humanity represents the problem, but it's not spread equally throughout humanity. You know, the impact that, and believe me, I live in Vermont. I've been composting, recycling, organic gardening since the 1970s, all important stuff and good stuff, and I encourage everyone to do it. But I also recognize that all of our efforts to curb pollution, you know, everyone on this Zoom and everyone in the state of Vermont working as individuals still is not adequate to address the problem, because that one paper plant in Glens Falls, New York, right, the base of Vermont, is producing enough pollution in one day to undo everything that we've done in our lifetimes as individuals. So we need to address this systemically as well. But it's not either or, it's both.
Right, so it's operating on,
go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna just sort of comment that, right, so it's operating on sort of all scales, right? So we're thinking about not just personal change, but also it needs to sort of be at that macro level.
I believe so. You know, and I think that the problem is so dire, so widespread, so compelling that you can enter into it at almost any point, and that every individual knows for themselves how they can work most effectively. For someone maybe, you know, teaching a class or writing a paper, or someone else it may be starting a garden, someone else it may be organizing a demonstration. I think it's wide open, and I think each individual needs to find the way that they can enter into that process of change most effectively. And that depends on your individual circumstances. Some people are going to be very limited in what they can do because they've got to struggle just to put food on the table.
I have a question. I told you before we started this that I have a cousin who lives in Vermont, and the thing that he focuses a lot on, and he actually ran for governor last time around, or whatever, but just to be able to get his thought out there. which is a constitutional amendment that would give the earth rights, something along those lines. In other words, a legal approach to the issue that you're raising here. And I was just wondering if you had any thought about that particular approach.
I'm sorry, it froze up just
Oh,
after
really?
you told me he ran for governor. Can you repeat?
Oh, okay. Okay. He ran for governor because he wanted to get across he has this one issue that he really wanted to raise. He had no idea or any inkling of wanting to be governor, but he did want to have a platform to raise this issue, which is a constitutional, giving Earth a constitutional right. You know, making it part of a constitutional amendment that gives Earth certain rights that it is not represented at this point. I'm just wondering, and in terms of sort of the thing you were talking about with education, I guess it falls into that category. It also might, if it were actually to happen, I suppose it would also force institutions that behave in a slightly different way. I don't know. I just wondered if you thought about that or heard about that and had any idea.
I have heard about it, not in great detail, but I thought it was very intriguing. And I think it's, you know, it's a great idea, even if it's just a heuristic device, even if it's just to educate people about the concept. Absolutely. We have so little regard for any other aspect of life on Earth. So little regard for human life, even. It's shocking, and it seems so much against the whole dynamic of evolution, as I understand it. And that's frightening, because we do have the power to destroy on an unprecedented level today, and there seems to be very little standing in the way of those destructive forces at this point. But we also have the power to create. You know, we can restore ecosystems. We can create new forms of food production that don't put carbon into the air. We can transform our transportation system. All of it's all technologically possible today. It's not a question of needing to invent new technologies. It's a question of social will and priorities.
I do have one other question I'd like to throw out there, and that is that I appreciate the fact that you're putting these issues in a broad framework, a broad historical framework. I think we often talk about the social issues that we're facing, political issues and ecology issues and so on, and we sort of take them piece by piece, and we don't really look at the broad sweep of history. And I think it's really important that you're putting that in the context. My question is, like, for the things that people are involved with, and I'm pretty sure everybody on this call and many other people that couldn't make it today are involved in all kinds of political issues or social issues, ecological issues, trying to improve conditions. What you seem to be arguing for is that while people have to do that, they also have to keep the broader picture in mind. They have to strive for the bigger change, I guess you could say. Do you have any advice about that or experience about that? How you, for example, within the context of a particular struggle, raise these larger concerns, put it in, like capitalism, for example, moving beyond this kind of a system, how you integrate the immediate reform struggle, you might say, with a more strategic vision?
Well, you know, the thing about a utopian approach is that you have a vision, and that vision may be far in the future. And actually, at its most profound, if you have a truly utopian vision, as you approach it, it's going to keep receding into the distance. But you have a vision, and then you can use that vision to orient the little steps that we're taking today to make sure that at least they're moving in the right direction. Because often, or I don't know if often is fair, but sometimes what I've seen is that people take action out of a real sense of urgency without really thinking through what the implications of it are. Is this really taking us where we want to go? And for me, I keep going back to those ethical touchstones that I keep reiterating. The idea that any institution or organization that I work with, I want to see if I can find ways to make it less hierarchical, more participatory, more democratic, mutualistic, more diverse,
Mhm.
and to try to be consistent in how those are applied at various levels of action. Once again, no easy answers to any of this. I don't want to sound glib. I don't want to sound like, oh, social ecology has all the answers.
Mhm.
But I think it provides some important insights and raises some crucial questions and offers some suggestions that personally I've found extremely useful in framing my own actions and activities.
Do we have other questions? Maybe anyone who isn't at a keyboard, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can do so now.
It's like Roger.
Roger?
Yeah, I believe there was a lawsuit recently, and I believe that was won by young people in the, I think, Washington State area that did give nature rights that you were talking about. And I don't remember the details, but I believe that was, that lawsuit was actually one that did give nature rights.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I may have heard something about that. It was in Washington State.
Yes, yeah,
Okay, I'm going to go online when we get off and check it out.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, young people are, as far as I'm concerned, young people are where it's at.
Yeah.
I mean, it's encouraging to see old people here too. But I know, for the Institute for many years, we'd have gatherings, and increasingly I'd look around and it would be a sea of gray hair. And just in the past 5 years or so, we've seen young people flocking to us.
Mhm.
And you mentioned the Iroquois nations and the way they put people and nature first. In other words, they all felt it all worked together. And then when the Europeans came in, they changed it to make it more like property and money first, and change that whole dynamics, and then base the economy on slave labor. And so we ended up, that kind of has continued on as a master slave kind of situation with corporations and so forth. So we need to go back to what the Iroquois and others did in a more cooperative way, just like, say, locally here we have Rainbow Grocery. It's all completely cooperative. There's no hierarchy. And that's what needs to be changed, and to get rid of this kind of corporate capitalist and domination approach that you've been talking about, and go to a cooperative kind of, business model. Or like in our area here, we have community organizations, neighborhood organizations, and we bring in, politicians, say, this is what we want, and we get them to work with us. And then there's several, number of these in this area, like in this district, say of San Francisco, and then there's this District 11 Council. So there's people that represent all these different organizations that get together, say once a month before the pandemic. So so that's the kind of thing I think you're talking about. And if we can expand those kinds of things to, like you say, deal with the politicians and get them to listen to us, and change this whole dynamics.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's the way we're going to change things. And it's not going to be quick, and it's not going to be easy, but there also come certain points that, there are tipping points in history. But let's not be naive. I think Karl Marx said it, the revolution with a capital R is the moment of birth after 9 months of gestation. We're still in a gestational period.
Right.
Are there other questions? Let me think here. Maybe just as one sort of final thought, I was listening to another author give a talk who said that, maybe one of the more exciting things about the moment that we live in, or where we're just kind of at, maybe within that gestational period, and you were kind of highlighting this, is that in some ways we're in like I think that other author talked about us being in, a lot of the work that's being done now is pedagogical. It's about teaching and then sort of implementing and following through, but that in sort of that process there's a way in which the logic of the current society, how would I put it? Some things are sort of, as you learn and grow, cut off and from your thinking, and that's what sort of allows new horizons, right? If we're always sort of striving for a utopia, we need to be doing the creative things that bring up these new horizons, and we kind of move towards them. I don't know if you had other thoughts on that, or maybe a suggestion for something we could go out and read or like look up as we sort of learn and grow.
Yeah.
In our current
I really agree with you, and I think creativity on every level has a crucial role to play. We need to be able to move beyond the given, to transcend what is, and to imagine, at least imagine what could be. If we can't do that, then we're going to be stuck. So, and that is a creative act, an act of creative thought. I also personally believe very strongly in the role of the arts and the kind of transformation that we're talking about. A little bit of shameless commerce here. I mean, I'm not writing academic stuff anymore. I write novels. I have a novel out about the Lower East Side and the experience there. I have another one coming out in a month or so about communes in Vermont in the 60s and what happened there. I do have a collection of essays out that if folks want to read some of my stuff, it's called The Anthropology of Utopia, New Compass Press. And I would also, creativity is going to be crucial. It's going to be crucial. Also, before we go, I want to just mention that the Institute for Social Ecology, which we started 47 years ago, is still going strong. We have a website, which is social-ecology.org, if folks want to check that out. And we offer a series of online courses exploring these ideas, the ideas that I've raised here in much greater detail, and other things. We have a sort of introductory course called Ecology, Democracy, and Utopia. We have a class about the Frankfurt School, critical theorists, sort of high-level philosophy stuff that's being taught. We have a course on understanding anti-Semitism, and we have a new course, on the philosophy of social ecology starting this spring, and another on energy and agriculture from a social ecological perspective. So feel free to check stuff out, and hopefully this is the beginning of an ongoing dialogue. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you folks. My wife grew up as a Unitarian. I have tremendous respect for what you folks are doing. And I think you're sort of fellow travelers.
Sure. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you come and speak with us today. We've really enjoyed it. Our next forum will be April 4th. Is that correct, Bruce? And if you're on our newsletter, you can.
Yes.
We'll be sending out a flyer about that. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Enjoy the rest of your Sundays, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. It's a pleasure.